Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship was one of the most terrifying and violent periods of Chilean history. Thousands of citizens were murdered, were tortured. This was the period when that ominous word, the disappeared, emerged.
Chile was seen as an island of democracy in Latin America until the Pinochet regime.
They said, yes, this is the one we want. And they told me to walk out of the hospital slowly and make sure that I didn't run, because they had two guns that they showed me to shoot me if I made any attempt to run.
General Pinochet's regime was a criminal regime. I think that's the most succinct way of putting it.
I believe the Pinochet dictatorship radically changed the trajectory of Chilean history. And even today, the discussions that Chileans have all the time, they are rooted in things that happened in the 70s and the 80s, both in terms of human rights violation and in terms of the economic policy that was implemented.
This is a battle which is still going on. It's actually defining our own time, the question of neoliberalism and the fight against neoliberalism. We remember Pinochet not just because of his cruelty and sadism, but also because of his personal construction of a new global economic order. You can't underestimate the world historical significance of what he actually did.
In the summer of 1973, the government of Socialist President Salvador Allende was falling apart. The commander-in-chief of the army, General Carlos Prats, had resigned. His replacement is Augusto Pinochet. Within a month, a coup would be launched that left Allende dead and the military in control of Chile.
I was a medical student, the second year of medical school, and the coup happened on the 11th of September, 1973, and I was going normally to the university, and I did reach the university when I heard that a coup was ongoing. And in fact, we stayed in the faculty of medicine, and we heard the Hawker Hunter planes going towards the center of Santiago from north to south and passing quite low near the medical faculty and bombing the Moneda palace. So we heard that.
Pinochet was appointed by Allende to be head of the army, and so he trusted Pinochet. Pinochet's predecessor, Prats, had to resign because the trigger was the wives of the senior officer corps demonstrating outside his house. Prats was a minister in Allende's government. He was briefly, I think, vice president. But Pinochet replaced him. Allende had full confidence in Pinochet.
General Carlos Prats was the head of the army in Chile. He was appointed in 1970 after the murder of General Schneider by right-wing extremists. It was a coup attempt backed by the United States. General Prats was a constitutionalist. He believed in the elected government. He was loyal to Allende until the end. And so elements within the Chilean military that were right-wing were opposed to him. They thought he was a block to any attempts to organise a coup. But Carlos Prats recommended to Salvador Allende that he appoint General Augusto Pinochet in his place, because he believed that Pinochet was loyal to the constitution just like him. He believed that Pinochet was a Democrat just like him, because Pinochet had shown no sign of being a right-winger, of having political views. He'd professed his loyalty to Allende again and again. He'd said, "I'll lay down my life to defend the constitution and the elected government." So Carlos Prats recommended Pinochet as his successor, and so in August 1973, Pinochet became Commander-in-Chief of the Chilean Armed Forces.
By September of 1973, it was clear that Chile was about to suffer another in a long line of coups d'etats that had recently overthrown other South American governments. After his recent promotion, Augusto Pinochet had to decide if he was in or out in the overthrow of his new boss, Allende.
Certainly, I think Allende was a man of incredible integrity. He was, I think, convinced, or he sounded convinced, that the armed forces in Chile were democratic and were constitutional, and that they were never going to stage a military coup in Chile. Chile had a relatively long history of democratic governments. So there wasn't many precedents where the army had interfered. And I think that also led to many people to believe that that would not happen, because there was no really tradition of military attempts or military coup. There had been some at the early parts of the century, but certainly not in the past 50 years, or certainly 40 years even, that Allende had been in politics. So I think we always felt, wrongly, we can see now, that in Chile the army was going to be constitutional, they were not going to have a military coup. There wasn't any tradition of that. We were wrong.
Pinochet must have been thinking about what to do in the situation of increasing instability, increasing violence, and a sense of paralysis with the government. And so I don't doubt that he was considering his options. And although he himself in his memoirs afterwards discussed planning seditious activity long before the coup, there's no evidence of that as yet. You know, CIA documents from the time say that he was apolitical during Allende's government. I think one document refers to his wife and son being pro-coup, but not Pinochet himself. And this is why I suspect he was actually an opportunist. When he realized that the coup plans were so far advanced that they were going to happen with or without him, really, he must have also known that he, as the commander-in-chief of the army, the biggest part of the Chilean military, would, just by taking part, be able to take it over, and that would open huge opportunities for his own power and for his own succession, as it were. And I think this is what happened. On the Friday before the coup, the delegation of Chilean officers, seditious officers, went to see Pinochet and demanded to know what his position would be. They'd been demanding for some time, and it was only on that Friday that Pinochet gave an indication that he would support them. And the coup happened, 4 days later.
So when the coup started to unravel in the morning of September 11 in 1973, many different events started to unfold, and Allende learned pretty quickly about what was taking place. So the first movements were in the morning, 6, 7 a.m., and the Navy started to retreat some of their exercises that they were going to implement that day, and it became clear for everyone that something was happening. Salvador Allende pretty quickly gathered everyone who was working at La Moneda Palace, so the government palace, and he asked them to leave the building. Then he just stood there trying to resist. So he said he was warned that a military coup was going to take place. He was offered the possibility of surrender, and and leaving the position of president. And he said no, that he had a democratic mandate from the people to be president. So and he was going to stay there to fulfill that commitment. And then, well, the rest is history, like they say a little bit, but basically he committed suicide when the military was bombing the government palace.
Salvador Allende killed himself with a gun given to him by his friend Fidel Castro. His family managed to escape to exile in Mexico. The coup had succeeded, and the heads of the Chilean Navy, Army, Air Force, and National Police comprised a new junta that ruled over Chile. But it was Augusto Pinochet who emerged as the supreme ruler of all.
The Moneda Palace in Santiago. There's more than enough evidence of the battle for the takeover of that palace, destroyed by remarkably accurate pinpoint bombing by the Chilean Air Force. But now the military regime has a harder task. Having won the battle for the palace, they have to win enough political support to stay in power. And that means they must try to convince those who supported Dr. Allende that they shouldn't have done so.
Salvador Allende's presidency had come to a terrifying end in September 1973. But the forces that had led to his downfall had not just come from within Chile, but from even more powerful forces within the world.
Salvador Allende was a doctor, a socialist politician. He was determined to improve the lot of the poor in Chile. But by 1970, there was a real sort of thirst in Chile for a change. People liked his call to end inequality, to reduce poverty, to make Chile a fairer society. However, the United States has long thought of Latin America as its sphere of influence, its backyard. And this was the Cold War. All US governments were terrified of the spread of communism and fearful of left-wing governments coming to power in Latin America. Remember, Fidel Castro had led a popular revolution in 1959, and US politicians were determined to prevent another Cuba, another left-wing leader coming to power in Latin America. Henry Kissinger famously said of Chile, "Why should we stand by and let a country go communist just because of the irresponsibility of its own people?"
The issue that was raised was whether somebody elected with 36% and, frankly, pursuing policies that we considered hostile to the United States should then do this, be be enabled.
You have the zeitgeist of an era, and the zeitgeist of 1970 was radical left. The Soviets seemed to be winning the Cold War. And so Allende comes into this febrile mix with a radical socialist program. But it is not communism. But it is a radical transformation of society. Now, he increased the incomes of the very poor. He made all education free, universities free, and so on and so forth. What Allende was actually introducing was no more than a North European welfare state, which we have today in all North European countries, this one included. That is all he was doing on that front. And in fact, 45% of GDP was government spending. But that's pretty much the norm for North Europe today. In fact, it's quite considerably less. The vulnerability, I think, and the dogmatic part of it, the ideological silliness, was the program of mass nationalization and confiscation, because by doing that you alienated America, amongst other things.
The general population is always being afraid of communism. I mean that's something that it penetrates. It's a very good weapon to use to scare people. It's going to be communist or communism, and so it's easy for them to do that and to say, oh no, it's going to be a socialist country, and people tend not to understand the differences sometimes.
Kissinger and Nixon started to think about a strategy of how to unseat Allende. since the very beginning, since he was democratically elected in September of 1970. It was a complicated operation because the United States has always been trying to appear as a champion of democracy, so they didn't want to intervene overtly. So they decided to basically do covert operations to try to destabilize the Allende government. And then they did that through many different strategies. And when the coup took place, they were obviously pleased.
Nixon and Kissinger facilitated the coup. They coordinated everything through the institutions of the US state and the para-institutions of the US state, transnational corporations and so on, with the assistance of local actors like the Brazilian government and other governments like the British government, the Australian government, we now know was also involved in supporting this seditious activity, in undermining Allende's government. Fundamentally, I don't believe that the Chilean right, as it were, the elite, had the social strength, had the institutional capacity, had the political strength at this juncture by 1970 to overthrow Allende by themselves. And I think this is clear when we think that despite American involvement, despite this huge economic, social, political pressure that was applied, the terrorism campaign, it still took 3 years for that campaign to destroy Chilean institutionality and create the space for a man like Pinochet to take power. That's why I think it's less facilitation and it's more orchestration.
Once the coup d'etat was successful, the notorious caravan of death descended upon Chile. This Chilean army death squad carried out dozens of summary executions, whilst thousands more were arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and disappeared.
We were detained by the police and taken to the Ministry of Defense and, treated quite roughly, and eventually to the National Stadium where they were concentrating people from all parts of Santiago, and heard lots of shots and people being, we didn't know because you only heard the shots. We didn't know if they were killed or they were doing it just to frighten us. We didn't know at that time. Later we learned that some people were killed in the National Stadium. That was the situation.
They took me to a van that they had parked outside the hospital, and they blindfolded me, and they took me, there are the 2 other people in the van, and they took me to one of the secret houses that they had, Villa Grimaldi, notorious place where many people disappear from there. And I was there for 24 hours, and then they transferred me to another secret house, detention house, where I was kept for about 2 weeks and where I was interrogated and tortured for about 2 weeks. And I was then transferred to another place where it was incomunicado, where there were not the secret detention houses, the torture houses, but it was like a prison, but nobody knew. Until that moment, for a month, my family did not know where I was. So I was then, finally, after the month, I was then, as I said, I was transferred to Cuatro Álamos, where it was mainly a place to be incommunicado. But I wasn't blindfolded, I was with other prisoners in one cell. And then it was a place mostly that would take you to recover from the injuries or whatever had happened with the torture. And after a week, I was transferred to Tres Álamos, one of the many concentration camps that they had built around the country. And I was there for about a year. And only when I got to that place is that my family got to know that I was alive, and then they could visit me once or twice a month.
I was bruised. I was never unconscious. We were hit with rubber truncheons, and to create obviously internal hematomas and things like that. but not to have an open wound in the skin. So they took some precautions in that respect. Their main object, because we were not a target group, then the main thing was to frighten us and to see if we could give them some information that they could follow up. So, as I said, this was a period of mass detentions where they were not targeting particular people.
Cleverly enough, electric shocks don't leave much marks except burns, which they can go. And electric shocks in certain parts of the body don't leave marks, and which was the main type of torture that we're applying. And punches, yes, and some people would have them, but it wasn't the most common. It was mostly electricity, hanging, and things that do not leave obvious marks in the body, and that after a week or so, I mean, it was to recuperate mentally as well as physically. So we were certainly not given any medicine. I was taken to one of the very notorious secret torture houses that they had, which was called the Venda Sexy, because of the type of tortures that were applying mainly to women, in addition to the standard methods of tortures, where they also used a dog that had been trained to make sexual advances in women. And I was taken to that place, subjected to these tortures, and it was also well known because many prisoners there were raped, and I was certainly raped twice. And that was the fate that the majority of the people that were in that place were subjected to, or had.
One of the defining characteristics of the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile was the drastic economic experiments that were conducted on the country under his rule.
The question of Pinochet and Chile being a laboratory is the great million-dollar question. We have the Chicago School, the Chicago Boys, we have Milton Friedman's book, Free to Choose. Pinochet does something really extraordinary because previous dictatorships have always been about the nation. They've been about the fatherland. They've been about national power. They've been about ethno-nationalism, etc. They haven't been about free markets. Dictators tolerate free markets, but what they seek ultimately is the glory of the nation and secondly, control. So with many dictatorships like Franco's Spain, we're really talking about the corporate state. Chile was about something far, far different. It was about shrinking the state to invisibility. So pensions were privatized, education was privatized, health was privatized. They privatized everything they could.
There was about 30% unemployment in 1975, 76, when I was in prison and coming over to here. So this new model implanted by the Chicago Boys with the boot, with the military boot to help it out, was a massive change. I should stress that people tend to think of Pinochet only as a brutal torturer and dictator, but the economic consequences of the models, that because he could do it only because he had weapons at that time, and push a program of mass privatization of state assets in a complete uncontrolled way.
One thing to understand about Pinochet's economic policies is they went hand in hand with the repression. So his economic policies were carried out by a group of technocrats known as the Chicago Boys. They were economists who trained under Milton Friedman in the Chicago School of Economics. And they believed in monetarism, controlling the monetary supply, and this meant policies of drastically cutting public spending, reducing the state, privatization, slashing export tariffs, opening the Chilean economy to the world. It was really sort of a shock therapy for the economy. But at the same time, the armed forces were going round arresting and killing trade unionists, terrorising trade unionists, banning independent trade unions, and therefore drastically reducing wages, making it possible for wages to drastically fall. And so these were part and parcel of the same strategy, that you cut public spending, you increased unemployment, but you made sure that there was no resistance by repressing brutally the trade unions.
And it was the first country to do that, and it gave other people ideas. You see, when we speak of the Reagan or the Thatcher Revolution, we're speaking about a much later period in history. So Pinochet was a kind of generation ahead of Mrs. Thatcher and Reagan, and what he was offering was to make an entire nation a laboratory for a completely different way of being, where the state was a mere skeleton. It was to create a new order, a new economic order, an entirely different way, a radically new way of nation states to actually be. And it captured the imagination of people throughout the world.
When the Conservative government got into power and Margaret Thatcher was named Prime Minister, the relationship between the UK and the Pinochet dictatorship got better. And there were both sides of it. On the one side, the Pinochet dictatorship felt pretty isolated because of the human rights violation, and basically all countries in the world were against that, of course. And then when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, and she had a similar view about the economy than Pinochet, and then when the Falklands War started in 1982, Chile actually helped the UK in that war.
Secretary of State for Defense has just come over to give me some very good news, and I think you'd like to have it at once.
The message we've got is that British troops landed on South Georgia this afternoon, shortly after 4 p.m. London time. They have now successfully taken control of Grytviken. At about 6 p.m. London time, the white flag was hoisted in Grytviken beside the Argentine flag, and shortly afterwards the Argentine forces there surrendered to British forces.
During the Falklands War, Britain relied on a lot of help from Chile, but for many years this was shrouded in secrecy, and even if you look at the declassified British government documents today about the Falklands conflict, most of the information about Chile is still censored. It's because it's viewed as very sensitive, particularly for relations between Argentina and Chile. But what we know is that Chileans helped Britain in a number of ways. They passed on intelligence. In particular, they gave data from their radar sites in Balmaceda, in Punta Arenas in the south of Chile, key information for British forces. They allowed British aircraft to land in Chile, to refuel, to carry out reconnaissance flights from Chilean territory. So they helped Margaret Thatcher's campaign in Argentina in all sorts of ways.
Chile intervenes radically in the Falklands War, not formally, but it gives Britain the benefit of all its radar data. It forces Argentina to retain troops on the Chilean border among the mountains. It does very many other things for the Royal Air Force, with Royal Air Force planes in Chilean colours and so forth. At the time, nobody knew much about this. They knew Chile was being helpful. But for both Britain and Chile, there was a great importance to remaining mum, to remaining silent on the huge magnitude of what Chile had done for Britain. Britain wanted it to appear as if it was sole author of its victory. Chile didn't want to alienate the other South American states who are frankly sympathetic to Argentina. But Chile was an old ally of Britain. the relationship went deep, deep back to the early 19th century. Pinochet was a huge Anglophile, and so in terms of Mrs. Thatcher, she took a very clear, you might say, dogmatic view. Chile had helped save our bacon in our hour of need, and therefore she will never renege. She would never betray Pinochet. She would always support him because she felt this deep explosion of personal gratitude for what he'd done and a kind of blaze of personal warmth for Pinochet, which, given what we know about what he actually did, is rather amazing. But she took a fairly simple-minded view. You have to be loyal to the people who supported you in a war, and that was it. There was no further argument with her.
And after that, after the Falklands War, Britain attempted, or Margaret Thatcher's government attempted to repay Pinochet for his support. British diplomats, for example, worked really hard behind the scenes in the United Nations throughout the 80s, trying to water down international criticism of the Pinochet regime. And Margaret Thatcher also loosened restrictions on arms sales to the Pinochet regime after the Falklands War, and sold all sorts of material, including cluster bombs, to the Pinochet regime.
By the end of the 1980s, Pinochet's hold on Chile was faltering, and it would finally come to an end thanks to the 1988 Chilean plebiscite, where a referendum was held on whether Pinochet's rule should continue.
Deprived of even the most basic expression of democratic rights for the last 15 years, they gathered in Santiago today in their tens of thousands. It was the culmination of the presidential referendum campaign. Moderate Christian Democrats, socialists and communists marching together. The flags of 17 different political parties making up the command for the no. All of them united in opposition to the regime of General Pinochet. It was the biggest political rally yet seen in the capital.
The end of the Cold War essentially meant that the regime no longer had any relevance to Western governments. Suddenly it no longer mattered. You didn't need hard men in military uniforms and toothbrush moustaches. You didn't need fascists anymore, Francos and so forth, to sustain the West. There was no longer a division, a binary division of the world between us and against us. And so Pinochet could hardly really fit in, and it actually occurs at almost precisely the moment where he has the famous referendum in 1988. The collapse of the Berlin Wall is the next year.
Once the plebiscite had been agreed, then there was obviously going to be some kind of campaign around it. And there were a social element to that campaign, there was a media element to that campaign, and a political element to that campaign. And one of the Christian Democrat leaders from the period, a man called Andrés Saldívar, has left a testimony of traveling to Europe to get funds for this no campaign. And I think he talks about gathering something like $400,000 to $500,000 US, which is quite a lot of money for the late 1980s. And that this money is what was used to fund the no campaign, to fund the advertising campaigns, the TV slots that were given to the no campaign and so on. And they recruited a very able team of marketing people and so on, and journalists who decided, rather than using the negative side of the dictatorship, rather than reiterating all of those negativities, to focus on a positive future. And that's why they used the slogan, "Joy is coming," and it was remarkably successful.
This morning, the army took up position around key government buildings in Santiago. But with so much international pressure for this vote to be free and fair, they're keeping a low profile so far. The opposition's final opinion polls indicate a clear victory for them. The government insists otherwise, although ministers do admit it will be close. On the eve of this vote, then, the people of Chile have every reason to question what General Pinochet and the army will do next. In theory, then, this is Pinochet's last chance. In practice, though, dictators don't usually hand over power so democratically.
It was a very important year. So the electoral registry was open for everyone to go and register to vote. political parties were able to organize and provide a campaign to vote against Pinochet. And also the incumbent government, in this case the dictatorship, also organized political campaigns to try to win that election. And then after a very heated campaign of 1 month, where television was very important because lots of political advertisement was going through at prime time essentially, and also lots of rallies were taking place, and people for the first time were gathering and having a conversation about what had taken place in the previous 15 years.
And there was a big discussion among the opponents of Pinochet whether he would accept the verdict of the ballot box. And in fact, there's evidence that because it was in his own itinerary, because he enacted a constitution in 1980, in the absence of electoral registers, so anybody could vote 2 or 3 times if they wanted to. So it was a totally, there were no international observers in that kind of referendum. And yet that produced a chronogram that would allow in 8 years for Pinochet to have a referendum for the continuation of Pinochet. And that referendum led to a very unexpected result for Pinochet, which was a 45% rejection of Pinochet.
Pinochet did not take the results of the election lying down and attempted to hold on to power, but his influence over the military had faded, and a genuine democratic election was held the following year. Pinochet remained as commander-in-chief of the army for a decade and was made a senator for life. But in 1998, he was indicted in Spain for his crimes committed in office, and he would be arrested in London, where he was receiving medical treatment only a few days later, in a stunning legal event that captured headlines the world over.
So when he was still at the London clinic, we heard news through people that worked in the London clinic, that he was about to leave. There were, interested enough, people that were doing cleaning, and somebody gave a tip that Pinochet was about to leave the country, and so the Spanish thing was quickly accelerated, and they managed to get the order, and the Scotland Yard arrived at the clinic, and Pinochet had his own guard, security guard and military looking after him, but the Scotland Yard told them they had to go, and now he was under arrest. And that was certainly, I think, a very important event for us, for Chileans that were seeking justice, for the world, for what it meant to be able to do that to a dictatorship in a foreign country, and for Chile, because I think in Chile, it was a shock for them to realize that Pinochet had actually been detained. It was untouchable at that time, and people were not responding. They were paralyzed with fear of many, many years of repressions, and the fact that he had been arrested really was a call for many people in Chile, and certainly in the UK and in Europe and many parts of the world, there was a strong solidarity movement supporting us in London, the people who were here trying to support as much as we could.
Pinochet's arrest here in London was a huge blow to his self-image and to his image within Chile. Also to the image held by those who supported the dictatorship even after finding out everything that had been done. The fact that he could be arrested in a Western capital showed them how much of an outsider he was, and how universal the condemnation of his regime had become.
In the end, Pinochet was allowed to return to Chile after a long legal battle. However, he soon faced further indictments at home, but now without his immunity to protect him.
Well, what happens is he loses immunity. He has immunity as a former president, and he has immunity as a life senator. All that goes, and he's pursued through the courts. But there is a great problem. He has a magnificent defense, that of vascular dementia. He said, if it happened, I don't remember it. And if it didn't happen, I don't remember it. And so this is how he is able to elude a trial. He is never actually put on trial. They're pursuing him in the end with 300 criminal charges, not only what was done under the dictatorship, the torture, the disappearances and deaths, but also the corruption, the arms deals, the taking a percentage, the tax evasion. He accumulates a fortune of $25 million, well disguised by living in a modest home. And so he dies under house arrest. And he is given a military funeral, not a state funeral. He's given a military funeral as former head of the armed forces. And during that funeral, the grandson of General Prats spits at the coffin.
I believe the Pinochet dictatorship permanently affected the way that Chileans treat each other, the things that they talk about, and what their aspirations are, and how much trust they have in the state, how much trust they have in the police, in the army, in their neighbors, how much trust they have in the political parties, and how much faith they have in governments in bringing them prosperity.
I think I have to give credit to Pinochet in one area. Although he was intellectually very limited, he was extremely foxy and pragmatic in some respects. And for example, he reserved 10% of the sales of copper to fund the military. So this didn't go to the coffers of the treasury. They went directly to the army. So he funded, and this meant support from his fellow army officers for him, because he had engineered this clever way of diverting an important part of Chile's wealth to what later on was corruption within the army. And I mean, he was corrupt. He ended up as a proven corrupt dictator, just like the Central American dictators we used to laugh about.
He was never brought to justice for the crimes he committed, but he is not the only one. There are still many, many people involved in this, in torture and detention, kidnapping, assassination, who haven't been brought to justice, and some that have been brought to justice were then sent to a very luxurious prison, and others, the trials have never been completed. We've been waiting for a little bit of justice in our own case. I said we, myself, and another group of compañeras that were with us in the torture houses for over 20 years, and we haven't had justice yet.
The problem, I think, with Pinochet is that he's not in any normal capacity, a normal category. He is an authoritarian, he is a brute, but he's not actually a genocidalist like some of them are. He's not actually an ethno-nationalist like some of them are. He's not a mere authoritarian like so many of them are. What he is an ideologue. And that ideology suffuses our own times, and he was the beginning of it. He was the alpha of the world we live in today, which is an extraordinary conclusion to make, but he turned his entire nation into a laboratory, into a unique kind of economic experiment, and nobody really compares with that.
But Pinochet became a hate figure around the world also because there was an enormous Chile solidarity campaign protesting against the human rights abuses in Chile. You know, Salvador Allende had inspired people around the world. His idea of a peaceful road to socialism, a peaceful road to a fairer society, had inspired people, and they were horrified when he was overthrown. So you saw a Chile solidarity movement in Britain, across Europe, across the world, and it was also for that reason that Pinochet became recognised as one of the most hateful dictators in modern history.